Uh, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I welcome all to this event on Kashmir Solidarity Day. Ladies and gentlemen, people in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir are facing extraordinary human rights violations and crimes against humanity. The Indian actions of 5th August 2019 further intensified the situation. All actions in the wake of 5th August 2019 contradict the United Nations Security Council resolutions, bilateral agreements, and international law. Today, on the Kashmir Solidarity Day, we are here to express our full support for the Kashmiris' right to self-determination. No doubt, it is a panel of very distinguished people. I shall introduce each of them at the time of giving them floor. When we talk of human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir, we need to be aware of the scale of violations there. More than 70,000 to possibly 100,000 Kashmiris have been killed during the last 30 years. There are 10,000 unmarked graves in Kashmir. Thousands of Kashmiris have disappeared. Tens of thousands have passed through torture chambers. Kashmiri teenagers have been blinded with pellet guns. Thousands of young boys have been arbitrarily detained. Protests have been violently suppressed. Women have been subjected to sexual harassment, humiliation, and intimidation. The tragic story of brutalization of Kashmiri society has several phases. At time of the partition in 1947, the genocide of Muslims in Jammu led to the death of a large number of them, estimated to be between 200,000 to 237,000. India has been using different tactics to strengthen its legal occupation on the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir. One of those tactics is to impose draconian laws there. For example, Public Safety Act of India is used in Indian occupied Kashmir for detention of Kashmiris for several months and even several years. Even the Supreme Court of India itself has declared the Indian system of administrative detention a lawless law. One Kashmiri leader has been detained under the Public Safety Act 37 times under the same law, but was not convicted under any charges. This is why United Nations, human rights organizations, and civil society of the civilized world have asked India time and again to repeal Public Safety Act. Similarly, another travesty of justice enshrined in the Indian legal structure is Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It has been designed to avoid accountability for Indian Army's excesses in Indian occupied Kashmir. It gives broad powers to Indian forces to kill and intimidate civilians and provide them immunity from prosecution in courts. However, among the Indian tactics, their effort to change the demographic structure of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir exposes the Indian ambition to make the Muslim majority into a minority in that region. India is implementing these changes through illegal domicile rules and by the introduction of new property laws. India is offering incentives to outsiders to facilitate their settlement on the occupied land of Kashmiris in violation of international law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention. We shall discuss these various aspects of human rights situation in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Today, it is a day of solidarity with Kashmiris. It is a day of making them realize that all people with conscience, whether they are living in South Asia or not, they are standing with Kashmiris. I shall request all panelists to restrict their interventions to 10 minutes. Now I invite Dr. Zafar Bangash, Director, Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought. He is a founding member of Friends of Kashmir Committee. He's an author of several books. Over to Dr. Bangash.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Consul General Mr. Abdul Hameed. And I'm honored to be with such a distinguished panel of guests, our Canadian friends, Karen, Robert, and Phil, and grateful to them for their consistent support for the rights of the Kashmiri people. As Consul General Abdul Hameed mentioned, today it is Kashmir Solidarity Day, and it is essential that we express our solidarity with the people of Jammu and Kashmir who have endured decades of oppression at the hands of India's illegal military occupation. The Kashmiris have not given up their quest for freedom despite living under intolerably difficult conditions. Prolonged lockdowns, breaking into people's homes for illegal searches, arrest of people on mere suspicion, and torture and deaths in prisons are common experiences for Kashmiris, compounded in recent years by the use of pellet guns that have blinded thousands of young children and therefore incapacitated them for life, as well as the ongoing pandemic. The Indian occupation forces have also indulged in mass rape of Kashmiri girls and women. While the Kashmiris' voices are stifled, we must raise ours on their behalf. It's important to keep in mind that the state of Jammu and Kashmir is not a piece of choice real estate over which two countries are fighting each other. That's in fact the narrative that India would like to present. At the heart of it, it is the Kashmiris' legitimate struggle for legal, political, and human rights. And India's denial of these rights has negatively impacted the Kashmiris economically, socially, and culturally. At the root of this problem lies India's stubborn refusal, despite giving pledges in the past to the Kashmiri people, as well as to the international community, and enshrined in at least 12 UN Security Council resolutions to hold a referendum to allow the Kashmiri people to determine their own future. The most recent expression, incidentally, of this was the UN General Assembly resolution that was passed with consensus on December 17th, 2021, supporting the right of self-determination for all people under occupation, including the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Instead of abiding by its international obligations, India is involved in a policy of brutal suppression, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. February, the month of February, also reminds us of another grim anniversary, that of the gang rape in 1991 of scores of Kashmiri women and young girls in the twin villages of Kunan and Pushpora by Indian military forces, the Rajputana Rifles. Human Rights Watch put the figure of the number of girls and women raped at between 23 and perhaps as high as 100. Despite overwhelming evidence, regrettably, not one person has been held accountable for that horrible crime in which girls as young as 7 and women as old as 70 were raped. In one particularly horrifying case, a pregnant woman gave birth to a baby boy with a broken arm after suffering a repeated rape by these Indian soldiers. Now, the question that we as Canadian citizens, those of us who are Canadian citizens, have to ask ourselves is as to how we can help the legitimate cause of the Kashmiri people. We live in the information age. I believe we should use every social media platform to highlight the suffering of the Kashmiri people and expose India's brutal nature. The Kashmiris' moral, legal, and political struggle has to be brought to the attention of the broader Canadian public, who I'm convinced will support their struggle for the right of self-determination. The intellectual struggle equally important. Towards that end, the following steps should be considered. First, there is a need to establish a research institute to produce academic papers on the long-standing Kashmir dispute. The proposed International Institute of Kashmir Studies, or whatever name is finally agreed upon, should be established either in North America or Europe. Its task would be to engage academics, journalists, human rights activists, and students to work on the issue of Kashmir. I'm glad to say that Karen's daughter is currently, Michaela is currently doing her PhD in Kashmir studies at York University. And I think it is these kinds of efforts that need to be encouraged and promoted so that the issue of Kashmir can be brought at an academic level. Secondly, there should be frequent visits by academics, journalists, and human rights activists to Kashmir to better familiarize them with the ground realities. Regrettably, India has refused permission for foreign delegations to visit Indian occupied Kashmir. But even if these visits take place to Azad Jammu and Kashmir, which is on the Pakistan side, there are literally tens of thousands of Kashmiri refugees that live in Azad Jammu and Kashmir who have been separated from their families for decades. And their stories can be narrated and then conveyed to these foreign delegations and hopefully published and highlighted in the media so that people would become familiar with the true situation in Indian occupied Kashmir. As Canadian citizens, we must make greater effort to urge the Canadian government to live up to its obligations by upholding international law and speak out against fully documented human rights abuses by the occupation forces in Indian occupied Kashmir. India's supremacist ideology of Hindutva that poses a serious threat to world peace must also be exposed. This necessitates reaching out to civil society groups like those that Karen, Phil, and Robert are involved in. We in the Friends of Kashmir Canada have done just that over the last 20 years. Demand for the Kashmiris' right of self-determination should be front and center in every international discourse until the Kashmiris are able to exercise this fundamental right in a free and fair manner. The alternative, of course, is more suffering for the Kashmiris because of Indian belligerence and brutality. On February 1st, Amnesty International published a report exposing Israeli crimes of apartheid in occupied Palestine. We should urge Amnesty to do a similar study on India's oppression and genocide of the Kashmiris. We know there is suffering in many parts of the world, including Palestine, Myanmar, Yemen, Afghanistan, etc. The Kashmiris also deserve our support. We must not fail. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bangash. It was a very useful intervention. And now I invite Ms. Karen Rodman. She is a retired civil servant and currently serves as Director Just Peace Advocates. She has 30 years of experience in public policy. She is a founder and CEO of Just Trade. Over to Karen Rodman.
Shukriya, Assalamu alaikum. I am joining you today from Kawartha Lakes in central Ontario, which is on 1818 Treaty 20 land that is the Indigenous home of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, and the Wendat people. And today, as we consider colonialism in Indian-occupied Kashmir, we also remember that Canada was founded on and continues to be party to ongoing violence against the Indigenous people across Turtle Island. Thank you so much for including me in this Kashmir Day program as we consider over 7 decades of broken international promises for the people of Kashmir. Let us remember that it was India which on December 31st, 1947, first brought the matter of Kashmir to the United Nations. Less than a month later, under United Nations Security Council Resolution 39, the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan was formed. And following that, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 47 on the 21st of April, 1948. Resolution 47 laid the basis for the resolution or resolving of the Kashmir issue. Canada very much had its fingerprints on this resolution, with Canada's then United Nations representative, Andrew McNaughton, also being the president of the United Nations Security Council and having shown leadership in the drafting and approval of that resolution. Then on January 5th, 1949, the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan laid out the detailed plan for self-determination for the Kashmiri people. Both India and Pakistan had already accepted the proposal beforehand. The approved plan provided details for a free and impartial plebiscite promised in the United Nations Security Resolution 47, and included details related to free right of return with the provision to exercise the rights as citizens for those returning. It also provided for freedom of press, speech, and assembly, and the freedom of travel in the state, including freedom of lawful entry and exit. It also called for the release of all political prisoners. It would have seemed reasonable to be optimistic at the time that the people of Jammu and Kashmir indeed would have their right of self-determination recognized through the plebiscite that had been promised to them in Resolution 47. But of course, the forces of imperialism and colonialism were at place, even in this immediate post-World War II world that had its hopes pinned on the shiny new institution of the United Nations. So here we are, 74 years later. Jammu and Kashmir remain an internationally recognized disputed territory. Still no plebiscite, still no right of return for generations exiled, and even less freedom of assembly, speech, and the press. And this, of course, has been shown in many ways over the last number of months, but last month in particularly with the horrifying storming and takeover of the press office in Srinagar. With the revocation of Article 370 and 35A in early August 2019, the way was set to move from decade-long military occupation into an aggressive settler colonization in Indian-occupied Kashmir. Settler colonization was given the full green light when on March 31st, 2020, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, the Indian government introduced the new domicile law. This law shifted the focus to demographic change and to aggressive taking of land and resources from the indigenous population of Jammu and Kashmir. The domicile law is counter to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 47 and the subsequent 5 United Nations Security Council resolutions that took place and that were passed in the 1950s that call for the plebiscite to determine the future of the disputed territory. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states that the occupying power shall not transfer its own civilian population into territory that it occupies. And under Article 1, all high contracting parties, which includes Canada, are required to take action to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances. Over the last 2 years, colonization of Kashmir has been happening at the speed of light behind a veil of silence, with communication blockages and a world focused on COVID. The demographic change is well underway through issuing of at least 4 million domicile certificates, while terror and fear are used to silence the Kashmiri population. From what I hear, it feels to me a lot like 1948 Palestine in the years immediately after the partition plan, with cultural genocide, silencing, and societal change with a military occupation and brutality. During the Canadian election this past fall in 2021, questions were asked of all candidates and parties related to Kashmir. The Bloc Québécois was the only party that responded. They indicated they would support a parliamentary motion to hold the Indian government accountable. We wait for them to respond now post-election. Also, after the election, all elected officials were provided information about Kashmir. And on November 22nd last year, the leading global human rights defender, Karam Perez, was arrested at his residence in Srinagar following a raid of that residence and his office, which is the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society. This arbitrary detention has been condemned by UN experts, mainline media, and human rights organizations around the world. In Canada, almost 2,000 letters were sent to all elected officials in this regard. Our hope is that we can raise the awareness of members of parliament about the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir and call on them to start the work that they had started 70 years ago with Canadian leadership at the United Nations when Resolution 47 was passed. It is indeed an honor for me to be able to work and for Just Peace advocates to be able to work with Kashmiri and solidarity organizations here in Canada and around the world in our joint work to shine a light on the truth about the history and the present of Kashmir. As we near 3/4 of a century of broken international promises, may we work to make this light brighter, holding our governments, our media, our corporations and other institutional decision makers accountable so the promise for self-determination can be realized for the people of Kashmir. Salam and shukriya.
Thank you, Karen Rodman. Thank you for quoting exact resolutions and their paragraphs, and also quoting exact articles of Geneva Conventions. This is very important, that the international law perspective is highlighted. Now, I shall invite Ambassador Aizaz Ahmad Chaudhry. He is currently Director General, Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Earlier, he had an illustrious career as a Foreign Service officer. He does not like long introductions. He worked as Pakistan's ambassador to the US in 2017. Prior to it, he served as Foreign Secretary of Pakistan and spokesman of the Foreign Ministry. Over to Ambassador Chaudhry.
Thank you, Abdul Hameed, for organizing this event and also inviting me once again to your event webinar. My sense is that that today all Pakistanis living in Pakistan or across the world are commemorating a day that started in 1990 and ever since has been commemorated. This probably will continue forever because the people of Pakistan and the people of Jammu and Kashmir have been connected for centuries. The 70 years of atrocities by the Indian forces against the people of occupied Kashmir cannot sever those ties that were nurtured by centuries of context, by geography, by ethnicity, by faith. So you would always find the people of Pakistan close to the Kashmiris. Now, there are three fundamental issues that we are looking at. One, of course, is the right to self-determination, and I think Ms. Karen Rodman spoke about that also. This has been constantly denied ever since it was promised by the international community through the UN resolutions. And the Indians have been telling the world that we are talking to Pakistan and this would be resolved bilaterally, but when they sit bilaterally, they do not engage in any serious discussion. So as a result, both bilateral and multilateral routes have been closed down, and consequences that the Kashmiris are today even yearning after 70 years to exercise their right to self-determine their destiny. The second aspect, which has grown in severity and seriousness, is the human rights violations that are being committed. Fundamental freedoms have been denied. Disappearances are happening. Custodial killings are going on. Torture, rape as a policy instrument. All this is now reaching genocidal proportions. So it is not surprising that some of the people, those with conscience, are now raising their voice. For instance, the Russell Tribunal that was set up by Bertrand Russell for the Vietnam War has announced in Sarajevo in December last their concern and conclusion that the crimes being committed against the Kashmiris in the occupied Kashmir meet the definition of genocide. Similarly, a London-based firm, Stoke White, has approached the British police in January last month to arrest top Indian officials for war crimes in Kashmir, and they have invoked their application is filed under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Now, these options are coming up because the world is worried that these human rights violations, which were gross already, but they are now reaching the genocidal proportions. And it will be a terrible burden on the conscience, collective conscience of the international community if nothing was done about it. The third aspect is the assault on the very identity of Kashmiris. That assault started 2.5 years ago when the Kashmiri autonomy was seized and the Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh were made union territories to be controlled from Delhi. So there is ever since there is a demographic change happening and there is an electoral engineering happening. Millions of people, non-Kashmiris, have been given domiciles, and then electoral constituencies are being delimited with a view to bolster the Hindu vote and make the Muslims a non-majority in the Jammu and Kashmir. So the Kashmiris are worried. They're worried that their very identity is being taken away. Kashmiri, as they call it, is being taken away. So what do we do about that? And how should the world behave? Now, the question is that the world, unfortunately, has not been able to act against the Indians more firmly because of geopolitics that has evolved, whereby the United States would want to lean towards India with a view to preparing it and bolstering its status to counterbalance China. And that's why we noticed that despite the fact that there were voices raised from US legislators and others within the United States, the US government has tended to ignore or not pay attention to the atrocities in the Indian occupied Kashmir. This is a grave situation, and the Kashmiris are, I think, quite united, at least on this front, that they want their Kashmiriyat back. And even last year in June, when Prime Minister Modi called few Kashmiris, including pro-India Kashmiris, Gupkar resolution, they were all unanimous voice. So it is surprising. It is surprising that the Indians are not getting it. That this would probably that all Kashmiris just don't want to live with India. They want to determine their own destiny. So what would a desperate Modi do? Because there is now one option is to talk to the Kashmiris, talk to Pakistan, try to resolve this dispute through peaceful means. That's not what is apparent from the Modi side. The second is that Modi might continue to traverse on the path of seeking a military solution. Now we know that military solutions have always lost out to resistance for freedom, for quest for freedom, and therefore even in our western neighborhood, Afghanistan, for 20 years, a military solution was sought by the world's mighty military machine. But in the end, they reached the conclusion that a political solution is far more superior than a military solution. The third option could be that Modi might get desperate that Kashmiris are not coming around to accepting his changes. So he might create a distraction by carrying out a false flag operation and blaming it on Pakistan. Or he might engage in a limited kinetic confrontation with Pakistan like the one they did in 2019 February, carrying out a surgical strike. So if that happens, that would be a high risk strategy and the situation could get out of hands. And therefore, security dimension of the conflict is as important as anything else. It poses a direct risk to peace and security of our region and also to the world at large. So the international community just simply cannot stay silent on what's going on in Kashmir and what the Modi government is doing in Kashmir. We do hope that they will listen to these voices that cannot be silenced, will always be there. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan will continue to stand with the Kashmiris, and today is the day that reminds of us and the world that Pakistanis stand with Kashmiris. Thank you so much, Abdul Hameed, back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chaudhry. Now I invite Mr. Phil Taylor. His radio program, Taylor Report, carries regular features on South Asia. His radio journalism is known for informed analysis. Over to Mr. Taylor.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad to be part of this solidarity with Kashmir moment, and I'm glad that it's an annual event. I have to say that, of course, this has been a part of the problem for the Kashmiri people, is that the world has been, I would say, muted. They haven't been told. Canada certainly does not, its media does not make the issue of Kashmir visible. And therefore, we have a very big responsibility, I believe, to correct the situation. And I very much agree with the previous speakers, all of whom, by the way, have really added to my knowledge, but also had some very good practical suggestions on how we might do a better job of representing the issue of Kashmir. I want to say, by the way, at the beginning of this, that of course, we are in solidarity, and we are in solidarity with the people of Kashmir because of our common humanity. We are recognizing that the truth of the cause of the Kashmiri people. And once you acknowledge, all of us, a common recognition of the truth about Kashmir, then you are, from that moment, in my opinion, in solidarity, because you have noted correctly that Kashmir was promised that there would be a democratic resolution to the issue of how they would be governed and self-government. And that is something which causes us to be, I believe, in complete solidarity from the moment one recognizes the truth, that you have to then stand in solidarity with the people of Kashmir. We've been armed in this recognition of solidarity by the fact that this is already, and we are, actually it's a blessing at this moment, 2022, to say the United Nations has affirmed this. The promise wasn't casual. It wasn't somebody's opinion. It was agreed upon. And it was those years, 47, 48, I think are haunting the government of India. because what we should say to them is that every year now for you, India, is 1948. It was your idea. You proposed it, and the United Nations undertook to address the matter, and they did in a very responsible way. Remove the army and permit the people to have a plebiscite, to have a determination, self-determination. And that fact, which, as I say, arms us, makes us stronger. This is not something we have to debate about. It's already been affirmed. I think of what Joe Louis, the great heavyweight champion, legend, fighter, years ago, he said about his opponents, well, you can run, but you can't hide. And India cannot hide from the fact that a plebiscite was promised, and neither can Canada, neither can any of these powers. And so that is our affirmation. I notice, in my opinion, a weakening of the position of those who are occupying, or that country which is occupying Kashmir, is that you can tell by changing of labels. Sometimes it is an autonomous area, it is an autonomous state. Now I understand it's called a union territory. Well, see, that's changing labels. The labels change, but the people remain who they are. And they also in possession of their rights. So all the labels can come and go, but the Kashmiri people remain. And I really believe, by the way, the greatest proof, of the reality of the cause of right to self-determination of Kashmir, the demonstration of how true it is that it takes 900,000 Indian troops to deny it. And if you have 900,000 troops in an area where the people do not have self-determination, I would say to you, you are doomed. There is no way that you will prevail if you require brutal force to hold on to a territory which has never had a chance to express its will. I know that armies can be large and intimidating, but also, as political climate changes, as reality of the world of changing, shifting tectonic movement and of great powers, an army can disappear overnight. And I would think the Kashmiri people know that. I think we know that. And we have to be returning everyone's attention to the great process of decolonization. It is the most, in my mind, the greatest step forward of humanity was the defeat in World War II of people, leaders who thought they were born to rule. And World War II said no one is born to rule, that the self-determination of peoples, the end of colonial powers, colonial rule, colonial authority has got to happen. We went through a little interregnum, I would call it, of the notion in Washington and London that maybe colonialism was going to come back, that there was going to be a unipolar world. That unipolar world didn't last long. We've seen in Afghanistan, Palestine, and struggles elsewhere, that the idea that there are superpowers who can dominate has been changed. And now we're in a multipolar world once again, and that's a healthy world. And it raises the possibility and the likelihood of self-determination for the Kashmiri people. I would say probably in terms of what we need to do here, and Zafar, Brother Zafar touched on this and others, we have to abandon the colonial thinking that was held over from that time, post-World War II, the decolonization process hasn't been an easy one. And we yet today have the stigma expressed through, in Canada and the United States, there's a thing called the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, Canada. And they are English-speaking, white, Protestant countries, all of whom were colonial powers or part of a colonial process. So we have to decolonize. We have to say, decolonize your mind. Go to the principles of the United Nations, the Charter, United Nations Charter, which is a great humanitarian creation, and apply it to your relations with other states, and particularly apply it to the status of Kashmir. And I agree I like the idea of let's create a special university studies for this, and let's write and speak out, and let's all of us be in solidarity with Kashmir from now on and from 1948 on. It's 1948 again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Now I invite Mr. Robert Fantina. He is author of several books. As a journalist, he has been a regular contributor to several journals, including Counterpunch, Mint Press, Middle East Rising, Palestine News Network, and The Truther. He has been interviewed by various TV channels in different parts of the world. He is a member of the World Beyond War and board member of Canadians for Peace and Justice in Kashmir and Canadian Voices for Justice in Palestine. Over to Mr. Fantina.
Thank you. Good day. It is a privilege for me to be part of this panel with so many distinguished speakers and activists for international law and human rights. I greatly appreciate the marks that have been thus far made. There are many myths that the brutal, racist Indian government is fostering concerning illegally India-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Perhaps most insidious is that it is an internal problem of no concern for the international community. Among the many lies the Modi government tells, we'll first review this one. Dr. Bangash mentioned the fact that there have been 12 Security Council resolutions relating to Kashmir. I'll focus on just one such resolution. United Nations Security Resolution 47 states categorically that the status of Kashmir is to be decided based on the principle of self-determination. That article states in part the following, quote, "The earlier restoration of peace and order in Jammu and Kashmir is essential, and that India and Pakistan should do their utmost to bring about a cessation of all fighting, noting with satisfaction that both India and Pakistan desire that the question of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India or Pakistan should be decided through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite," close quote. Key specific components of this resolution are as follows. Component 7 says, quote, "The government of India should undertake that there will be established in Jammu and Kashmir a plebiscite administration, told a plebiscite as soon as possible on the question of the accession of the state of India, of the state to India or Pakistan." This commitment couldn't be clearer. India agreed that the people of Kashmir had the right to decide their own future. Article 8 states, quote, "The government of India should undertake that there will be delegated by the state to the plebiscite administration such power as the latter, the plebiscite administration, considers necessary for the holding of a fair and impartial plebiscite." Again, a fair and impartial plebiscite is clearly enunciated, and India agreed to this resolution. Article 11 said this: "The government of India should undertake to prevent and give full support to the administration and its staff in preventing any threat, coercion, or intimidation, bribery, or other undue influence on the voters of the plebiscite." Again, the article references that it should be a free and independent plebiscite. The article also references the early restoration of peace and order, and that this is essential. We have to remember this Security Council resolution was passed in 1948. The plebiscite has not occurred, and there is no evidence that India has any intention of ever allowing it to occur in violation of this and other United Nations resolutions. Another myth is that the high concentration of Indian soldiers in Kashmir is to ensure security. These so-called security forces are responsible for the arrests and disappearance of thousands of Kashmiris, including human rights activists, reporters, and journalists who don't write exclusively about the brutal occupation in a way favorable to India. As Ms. Rodman mentioned earlier, just last month, Indian forces stormed the press offices in Srinagar. That press office is now permanently closed. In late 2020, the Indian Chief of Defense spoke of putting adolescents and preteens into de-radicalization camps. He stated clearly that such camps existed. As reported recently in the Pakistan Observer, quote, "The colonization of outsider Hindus in Kashmir is going on, and the scale of atrocities has increased and is unprecedented," close quote. So much for ensuring security. While this is a day of security with the people of Kashmir, we must clearly show our solidarity. While this is a day of solidarity for the people of Kashmir, we must clearly show our solidarity throughout the year. One major way of doing this is to publicize what is happening to the people there. As Mr. Taylor mentioned earlier, Canadian news sources do not report on Kashmir. The news about the suffering of the Kashmiri people can usually only be found in independent news journals, but seldom, if ever, in what is generally referred to as the mainstream press. This is a blatant neglect on the part of so many journalists and a violation of their duty to report the news. In the absence of their reporting, we must act in their place. This means keeping well informed about the situation and posting that information on social media sites. Today, many people get their news from such sites, and if they don't see information about Kashmir, they will simply be unaware of the situation there. We must inform them. Additionally, we need to send letters to the editors of any newspapers we read. If there's no information about Kashmir, and as I mentioned, generally there isn't, we must ask them why that is the case. Armed with just a few basic facts, such as the denial of press freedom and India's violations of international law, a short informative letter can be created. And this must not be a one-time event. As we keep informed about the ongoing atrocities committed by India against the Kashmiri people, we must write about them and submit articles to any journals that will accept them. We must also pressure our elected officials, as Ms. Rodman mentioned, to act for justice, human rights, and international law. At the present time, India controls the narrative. We must take that control. We have an example. For decades, the apartheid regime of Israel was untouchable. Any criticism against it was decried as anti-Semitism, which helped to silence opponents of that brutal regime. That is no longer the case, but it took constant, unrelenting effort by human rights activists to seize the narrative. The same must be done for the Kashmiri people, but we do not have the luxury of time. The brutal settler colonial project of India is rapidly moving forward, and the international community is not paying attention. We must force the nations of the world to attend to and prevent these atrocities. Every day, the suffering of the people of Kashmir accelerates, and more people die. Concerned people around the world are the only people who can stop this. We must inform them, and we must act, and we must do it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fantina, for such a candid statement. It was a very useful discussion today. The proposals of panelists for establishing a Kashmir Study Center in North America or Europe and arranging visits by academics, journalists, researchers, and civil society activists to Jammu and Kashmir were very useful. And Mr. Robert Fantina also drew our attention to inviting more and more journalists to write the truth and not to black out Kashmiri story from the mainstream press. Though we have seen in recent years, particularly during the last 3 years, New York Times, Guardian, New Yorker, Al Jazeera, that they have covered Kashmir well, but there's much more that needs to be done. It was, of course, clear in the discussion of today that India must adhere to its international human rights obligations and honor the commitments to grant Kashmiris their inalienable right to self-determination through a free and impartial plebiscite under the UN auspices. Moreover, all such clauses that provide impunity to Indian occupation forces should be repealed. The international human rights and humanitarian organizations, as well as the international media, should be allowed access to investigate the grave human rights situation and the likelihood of genocide in Indian occupied territory. I thank all of you for sharing your views and sparing time for this event. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.